Hey, I'm Austin, and today on Animal Quests, we are going into the dumbest deaths ever recorded in zoos. From a construction manager climbing a maintenance ladder into a jaguar corridor on the southern African highveld, to a travel writer stepping behind an elephant in a western Indian barn, the staff already knew was under stress. But first, let's start with the man who dropped into a predator corridor believing he understood the space better than he actually did. August 11th, 2017. The morning air was dry and cool across the southern African highveld, the kind of still, pale-skied winter day where sound carried far and shadows lay long across open ground. A private wildlife park sat behind a perimeter of scrub vegetation and earthen embankments, its enclosures built across uneven terrain. The facility operated outside the major accreditation networks, and portions of its infrastructure reflected the age of its original construction. Kellen Arvidsson was 29 years old. He worked in construction site management and had spent years navigating active work sites, reading spatial layouts, and assessing access routes. That professional habit had shaped the way he moved through unfamiliar environments, with a confidence that routinely outpaced his actual knowledge of the conditions he was reading. He had arrived at the park with colleagues for an informal group outing. Throughout the morning, he had positioned himself near staff access points and maintenance infrastructure, studying the geometry of enclosures with the same detached assessment he applied to construction sites. That's the part that stays with me about Kellen. It wasn't recklessness in the way we usually imagine it. Impulsive. Thoughtless. It was competence applied to the wrong problem. He was genuinely good at reading spaces. He'd spent years doing it. The trouble is that a construction site and an active predator enclosure are not the same kind of space, and nothing in his experience told him that. The jaguar enclosure was designed with a dry moat and a hidden perimeter fence that blended into surrounding vegetation. A maintenance access ladder on the outer wall was used by groundskeeping staff to service the buffer corridor between the visitor boundary and the containment structure. The ladder was part of poorly secured maintenance infrastructure, adequate for a facility with functioning access controls, insufficient for one without them. From the base of the ladder, the dry moat was not visible. The barrier layout gave the impression of greater separation between the visitor side and the enclosure interior than it actually provided. Kellen climbed the maintenance ladder and dropped into the service corridor on the other side. He had assessed the distance and the vegetation and concluded the active enclosure space was further from his position than it was. Jaguars are the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere, with adult males commonly exceeding 200 pounds and built entirely for ambush rather than sustained pursuit. Their musculature is proportionally more compact and powerful than that of other large felids, and their jaws apply more crushing force per unit of body weight than any other cat species. They do not stalk at length. An adult jaguar had been resting along the shaded edge corridor, a strip of ground between the main enclosure area and the outer maintenance zone used by the animal during the cooler part of the day. Although separated during normal maintenance operations, the corridor remained directly adjacent to the animal's active movement zone. When Kellen dropped from the ladder, he landed at ground level within that corridor. The jaguar oriented toward the movement and closed the gap in a short, direct burst. The engagement was single and immediate. A knockdown followed by a bite to the upper neck and cervical region. No secondary contact or sustained attack followed. The entire sequence occurred in seconds. Seconds. That word comes up again and again in these cases, and it never stops landing the same way. Not minutes. Not a struggle that extended long enough for anything to change. Seconds between a decision that felt reasonable and an outcome that couldn't be walked back. Death resulted from cervical trauma and airway compromise. Park staff responding to reports from the visitor area reached the maintenance zone and used auditory deterrents to move the animal back toward the interior enclosure. Emergency services were called, but the injuries were non-survivable. Kellen was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities conducted a formal review of the facility's access control and maintenance infrastructure, with particular attention to the separation between unsecured maintenance access points and active animal zones. The jaguar was not destroyed, with investigators concluding it had encountered a human who had entered its territory and responded with an instinctive territorial and attack response typical of large felids at close range. The park implemented additional locking mechanisms on all maintenance access points. Public response focused largely on the safety classification of private facilities operating outside standard accreditation frameworks. The next case moves us from a private facility with failing infrastructure to a public-facing attraction built specifically around close animal contact. a format that carries its own entirely different set of assumptions about what's safe. June 29th, 2018. The late afternoon sun hung flat and bright over a roadside wildlife attraction in the central United States, the air thick with summer humidity and the competing smells of cut grass and animal bedding. Cicadas droned steadily along the tree line beyond the car park. The facility operated as a combination zoo and supervised feeding experience, drawing families from surrounding towns throughout the summer months. Its enclosures had been built with close visitor interaction in mind, and staff conducted supervised feeding sessions at several exhibits across the day. There's something about the roadside wildlife attraction format that I find genuinely difficult to assess. They feel accessible, informal, local, and a lot of them are managed responsibly. But the format itself, supervised feeding, arms outstretched, animals trained to approach, creates a kind of practiced intimacy that can be very hard to distinguish from actual safety. Mireya Solkov was 31 years old. She had grown up in a rural area and carried an ease around animals developed through years of proximity to farmyard livestock. She treated that background as evidence of genuine competency with animals as a category, a logic that did not account for the substantial difference between domestic animals, habituated to handling, and captive wild predators, conditioned only to associate humans with food. She had arrived at the facility with family members that afternoon. During feeding sessions at earlier exhibits, she had extended food items past the designated reach zone without incident each time, and the absence of consequence had reinforced the behavior. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to frame what Mireya did as obvious. It wasn't. She'd done the same thing at 3 previous exhibits that day and nothing had happened. From her perspective, she had a data set. It just wasn't the right data set for a sloth bear. The sloth bear enclosure featured a moat-side feeding area where visitors could present food items to the animals under staff supervision. A primary and secondary barrier system defined the safe visitor zone, and staff instructions prior to each session specified that arms were not to cross the threshold of the inner barrier. The sloth bear present at the exhibit had been conditioned through repeated feeding interactions to associate visitors with food, but remained reactive in situations involving multiple simultaneous visitors, elevated noise levels, or unexpected proximity from an unfamiliar angle. During the feeding session, Mireya extended her arm past the inner barrier threshold, holding a food item toward the bear. The bear lunged upward from below the moat edge, closing the distance to her extended arm in a single movement. Sloth bears are heavily built omnivores with disproportionately long forelimbs and curved claws designed for tearing through compacted earth and insect colonies. Their defensive response to close contact stimulus is among the most aggressive of any bear species, involving sustained forelimb raking and powerful jaw engagement applied in short, repeated bursts rather than a single sustained hold. Defensive attacks by sloth bears frequently result in severe injuries to the head and upper body due to the animal's height and striking pattern. The bear's initial contact pulled Mireya off balance at the barrier. She lost her footing and fell forward partially into the moat-side containment area, placing her within direct reach of the animal. The bear transitioned from the initial lunge into sustained close contact mauling, applying forelimb force and repeated jaw contact consistent with its defensive escalation pattern. Staff were unable to enter the containment area until the animal had been secured behind an interior shift gate. By the time extraction was possible, the injuries Mireya had sustained were not survivable. Death resulted from blood loss and compounding trauma. Emergency services arrived at the facility, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. A formal investigation was opened into visitor management during feeding sessions and the adequacy of barrier separation at close contact exhibits. The sloth bear was not destroyed. Officials determined the animal had responded to a direct physical intrusion past the established safety threshold in a manner consistent with natural behavior. The facility suspended all feeding interactions pending a full review. Public response reflected significant debate around close contact wildlife attraction formats and the reliability of behavioral conditioning in captive wild animals. The cases we've looked at so far both involve visitors. The next one is different. It's a photographer, a professional, at a large, well-resourced facility, and the error, when it comes, has nothing to do with the quality of the infrastructure around him. September 3, 2015. The early afternoon sky over a large zoological facility in Central Europe was overcast, pale light diffusing evenly across concrete pathways and wide exhibit areas. The air was cool and dry at the edge of the season's turn, carrying the faint smell of damp stone and enclosure vegetation. The park drew moderate weekday crowds, families and tourists moving at an unhurried pace between the larger mammal exhibits. Vasco Dracos was 41 years old, a commercial photographer who had spent 2 decades working across advertising and editorial assignments. He carried professional equipment and operated with a professional's instinct for proximity, the belief that the best image required the closest possible position. That instinct had served him well in controlled studio and editorial environments. Applied to a live animal exhibit, it produced a set of decisions that had nothing to do with controlled conditions. The white rhinoceros enclosure was bordered by a decorative low fence that served as the visitor boundary, positioned several meters from the actual containment structure. The design was aesthetic, part of the facility's effort to present exhibits without visible industrial barriers in the foreground. The rhinoceros present in the exhibit was a large adult female, not sedated, resting in a low-movement state during the midday period. Vasco had assessed her stillness and concluded she was chemically sedated or otherwise non-reactive. That conclusion had no factual basis. That's the assumption that ends this story before it really starts. A large animal resting quietly in the middle of the day looks, to an untrained eye, like an animal that won't move. That's not what it is. It's an animal that hasn't moved yet. He climbed the decorative fence and moved toward the enclosure perimeter, closing distance to within a few meters of the animal to capture detailed photographs of her face and horn structure. White rhinoceroses are the second largest land animal on Earth, with adults commonly exceeding 5,000 pounds. Despite their size, they are capable of reaching speeds above 30 miles per hour over short distances. Their primary defensive response is a direct charge, initiated immediately from a resting position once a proximity threshold is crossed. The rhinoceros rose from her resting position and charged without preliminary display when Vasco closed distance, covering the ground between them in seconds. The impact at short range was direct and full weight, driving him backward and to the ground. She followed the initial charge with a secondary engagement, applying repeated horn contact and lateral head movement, consistent with the species' territorial defense pattern. The trauma from the initial impact was catastrophic. The secondary horn engagement compounded internal and structural injuries that were non-survivable at the scene. Emergency services were contacted by other visitors and park staff, but the severity of injuries precluded any intervention. Vasco was pronounced dead at the scene. There's something that feels almost unbearably preventable about this one. A well-run facility, a professional adult, a fence he chose to climb. None of the systemic failures we've seen elsewhere. Just one assumption: she's sedated, she won't move, and the distance it closed. Authorities reviewed the park's barrier design policy and the practical gap created when decorative fencing substitutes for clearly marked functional safety boundaries. The rhinoceros was not destroyed. Officials determined the animal had responded to a direct proximity intrusion in a manner entirely consistent with natural defensive behavior. The park announced a full review of perimeter marking across all large mammal exhibits. Public and regulatory attention focused primarily on the ambiguity created by aesthetic barrier design. The next case is different in almost every way. A restricted area, a night shift, and a gap in operational protocol so specific that it could only have been opened by someone who knew the facility well. December 18, 2012. A cold front had moved through the previous night, dropping temperatures into the low 40s across a large zoological facility in the southern United States, and laying a damp chill across the grounds that the weak winter sun had done little to lift. The sky was flat and gray, the air carrying the sharp smell of cold concrete and wet vegetation. Visitor numbers were low, typical of a December midweek period, and staff coverage across the facility had been scaled to match. Ewan Calder was 33 years old. He had worked at the facility for several years in a maintenance capacity, servicing infrastructure across the grounds during operating hours and occasionally during after-hours windows. His familiarity with the physical layout of the facility was extensive in practical terms: access points, service routes, enclosure adjacencies, the rhythm of staff movement across different areas. His knowledge of the specific operational protocols governing animal transfer scheduling was considerably less complete. The familiarity he had built with the space had produced a confidence in his ability to assess the facility's state at any given moment that was not matched by his actual awareness of what was occurring within it. He knew what a normal shift looked like. He thought he knew what was happening that day. The problem was that a rotation was underway and he didn't know it, and in a tiger corridor, that's not the kind of gap you can recover from. The tiger holding complex consisted of a series of linked enclosures connected by service corridors used for animal rotation, veterinary access, and feeding logistics. A planned enclosure rotation had been initiated during the earlier part of the shift. A security gate separating the maintenance side corridor from the active animal transfer route had been reopened as part of that rotation, creating a temporary window in which the service corridor and the active transfer path overlapped spatially. Ewan entered the service corridor during that window. He had assessed the rotation as complete. An adult Siberian tiger encountered him in the narrow corridor. Siberian tigers are the largest felid on Earth, with adult males regularly exceeding 600 pounds and measuring over 10 feet in length. In confined spaces, the spatial dynamic shifts entirely to the animal. The corridor geometry eliminated the distance required for any evasive movement or retreat. Tigers in enclosed high-stimulus environments, particularly narrow passages where an unfamiliar human is encountered at close range. The tiger detected Ewan's movement and sound within the confined corridor and initiated contact within seconds. The engagement followed the pattern typical of enclosed-range predatory attack: initial knockdown, followed by a neck and throat bite, with the animal using its body weight to maintain position. The corridor walls eliminated any movement away from the contact point. The attack was rapid and sustained. What the corridor does, structurally, is remove every variable except one. There's no distance to create, no barrier to put between you, no direction to move, just the geometry of the passage and what's already inside it. By the time Ewan was in there, the outcome had already been determined by everything that had happened before he arrived. Death resulted from cervical and vascular trauma from the sustained neck bite applied in the confined geometry of the service passage. Staff operating the rotation heard the disturbance and responded, but the window between Ewan's entry into the corridor and the fatal injury was too compressed for any intervention to be effective. The tiger was moved back to its enclosure through the rotation gate. Emergency services entered after the corridor was secured, but Ewan was already unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at the scene. A formal investigation into the facility's corridor access control procedures found that the security gate had been reopened as part of standard rotation protocol without a concurrent lockout procedure on the maintenance side entry point, creating the access overlap that allowed entry during active animal movement. The tiger was not destroyed. Officials determined the animal had responded to an unexpected human presence in a confined space in a manner consistent with natural behavior. The facility implemented dual confirmation lockout procedures for all maintenance access during animal transfer windows. Internal and regulatory attention focused on the systemic gap in access management that had made the overlap possible. In the cases we've covered, the people involved made decisions, some reckless, some reasonable, some professional. The next case is different in a specific way. The decision-making was compromised before the first step was taken. April 7, 2018. A mild spring morning had settled across a Midwestern zoological park, the air carrying the clean smell of new grass and recent rain, the sky a pale, even blue between stands of mature trees lining the exhibit pathways. Families had arrived early, drawn by the warm weather following a long winter, and the grounds were moving toward capacity by mid-morning. The atmosphere was relaxed, the kind of early-season day that attracted visitors who came more for the outing than the animals. I'll be direct about this one. It's the hardest case in this series for me to approach with the same measured tone I try to apply to all of them, because Tarian wasn't there to see the animals. He was there to provoke them. And I think that distinction matters, even if the outcome belongs to the same category as every other case here. Tarian Vellum was 22 years old. He had arrived at the park that morning with a group, and his presence at the chimpanzee exhibit was not incidental. He had identified the exhibit in advance and arrived with a specific behavioral plan: to provoke a visible reaction from the animals for distribution as social media content. Over an extended period at the enclosure perimeter, he struck exhibit glass, sustained high-intensity noise, and mimicked aggression toward the chimpanzee group. Staff observed the behavior and issued direct instructions to move away from the exhibit boundary. He complied temporarily before returning. A subsequent lapse in supervision in the immediate area created the window in which he moved to the first barrier. The chimpanzee enclosure was a large habitat with an outer visitor railing and an inner perimeter that dropped a significant distance into a moated enclosure floor below. Reaching the enclosure floor required climbing the outer railing, crossing a ledge, and dropping from height, a three-stage sequence requiring deliberate physical commitment at each step. Tarian climbed the outer railing and moved onto the inner ledge. His footing on the ledge surface was unstable. He lost his footing and fell. He didn't jump. He didn't vault deliberately into the enclosure. He was on a ledge he shouldn't have been on, doing something he'd already been told to stop, and he lost his footing. The intention and the outcome are two different things, and the chimpanzees had no access to either. Common chimpanzees are not large by the standards of great apes. Adult males typically weigh between 88 and 130 pounds, but their strength-to-weight ratio significantly exceeds that of a human of comparable size, and their attack pattern in territorial or threat response situations is characterized by rapid escalation and opportunistic involvement from nearby group members, combining biting, tearing, and forceful positional control. Tarian landed on the enclosure floor from height, the impact leaving him disoriented. The nearest adult male chimpanzee closed distance and initiated contact within seconds, biting and applying positional control while a second animal joined briefly, striking and grabbing in short, erratic bursts before moving away. The first animal repositioned its grip and bite points repeatedly, resulting in repeated displacement across the enclosure floor during grip repositioning. His head made repeated contact with the enclosure surface. Death resulted from fatal traumatic injuries, including severe head trauma, consistent with repeated impacts and sustained assault. The chimpanzees disengaged and moved away from the contact area as activity and noise increased from the visitor perimeter. Staff initiated emergency protocols, clearing visitors and moving the animals to a holding area. Emergency services entered the enclosure but found Tarian unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities reviewed footage capturing the full sequence, including the prior staff warnings and the deliberate barrier crossing. A formal investigation examined both the conduct of the visitor and the adequacy of real-time supervision across high-traffic exhibit areas. The chimpanzees were not destroyed. Officials determined the animals had responded to a direct territorial intrusion in a manner consistent with documented chimpanzee conflict behavior. The zoo announced a review of barrier height standards and visitor monitoring protocols. Public response was extensive and divided, with significant attention directed at the broader pattern of enclosure intrusion conducted for social media content. Every case so far has taken place in a managed facility during daylight or controlled hours. The next one strips almost all of that context away: nighttime, impaired judgment, open water, and an animal that had been in position long before anyone knew where to look. January 22, 2016. The tropical heat of a northeastern Australian summer evening sat heavy over a crocodile attraction operating along a regional tourist corridor, the air dense with wet season humidity and the smell of standing water and saturated vegetation. The sky above had moved from the white-gray of the afternoon cloud cover into the deep, overcast dark of a tropical night, with no ambient city light to cut it. The facility had reopened to the public after a period of restricted access and was operating at near capacity for a ticketed evening event, drawing tourists and locals across the grounds in groups. Orland Sedgwick was 27 years old. He had attended the event as part of a group marking a personal occasion, and the consumption of alcohol across the evening had reached a point that was apparent to others around him. His behavior during the hours before the incident had become progressively decoupled from his surroundings. Attention fragmented, spatial awareness reduced, movement less directed. He had separated from the main group at some point during the evening and moved beyond the boundary of the public event area in the direction of the crocodile enclosure. I don't spend a lot of time in these cases on moral assessment, but I will say this. The combination of alcohol, darkness, and a saltwater crocodile habitat is one of those confluences where every variable is moving in the wrong direction at the same time. No single factor makes it inevitable. All of them together make it very hard to see how it ends differently. The enclosure's waterline was separated from the event grounds by an outer perimeter barrier and warning signage posted at each approach point. The area beyond that barrier, including all ground adjacent to the water's edge, was restricted during both standard operating hours and event access. Orland crossed the barrier and reached the shoreline of the water feature. He was standing at the immediate water's edge when the attack occurred. A large saltwater crocodile was in the water near the bank. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile on Earth, with large adults exceeding 17 feet in length and over 2,000 pounds in weight. Their predatory strategy is built entirely on concealment and explosive commitment. They are capable of remaining submerged or at the water's surface without any visible indicator of their position or orientation, and their strike initiates from a stationary state with acceleration sufficient to close the final distance before any evasive response is neurologically possible. The crocodile had been stationary in the shallow water directly adjacent to the bank where Orlin was standing. The strike was vertical and immediate, jaws closing around the lower leg before any movement away from the shoreline was possible. The animal dropped its weight back toward the water and pulled in a single continuous motion. Orlin was taken into the water within seconds. The crocodile initiated a lateral death roll, its body rotating while maintaining grip on the lower limb. The rotational force generating structural damage to the joint and surrounding tissue as water filled his lungs. He did not surface after the initial submersion. The animal moved the body into deeper water after the roll sequence. That sequence, strike, pull, roll, depth, takes very little time, less time than it takes to read this paragraph. The crocodile didn't pursue. It didn't stalk across the event grounds. It was in the water where it had always been, and Orlin walked to the edge of that water in the dark. Death resulted from drowning during rapid submersion, compounded by severe rotational limb trauma. Recovery of the body required a coordinated operation conducted the following morning under controlled conditions. Staff at the event perimeter had not identified Orlin's movement beyond the restricted boundary before the incident occurred. Authorities opened a formal investigation into boundary control and monitoring protocols during evening events at facilities operating active apex predator habitats. Findings identified a gap in perimeter supervision during the event window that allowed unsupervised access to the enclosure shoreline. The saltwater crocodile was not destroyed. Officials determined the animal had responded to a direct proximity intrusion consistent with natural predatory behavior. The facility suspended all evening event access pending a full review of boundary design and supervision resourcing. Public response was substantial, with attention directed both at the conditions that allowed access to the shoreline and at the broader question of operating public events in close proximity to saltwater crocodile habitats. The last case in this series brings us back to daylight and to a very different kind of entry. Not an intruder, not a provocation, but someone with genuine professional experience and a specific creative purpose. What she got wrong wasn't the animal. It was the conditions the animal was already in. May 14th, 2016. The pre-monsoon heat of a western Indian afternoon pressed down across a wildlife park with the accumulated force of a season at its extreme. The air dry and bleached, the sky a hard pale blue without cloud cover, the temperature having climbed past the point at which the grounds fell largely silent. Dust shifted in slow, directionless movements across open areas. The facility's guided tour program had operated through the morning on a compressed schedule designed to conclude before the afternoon heat peaked. By early afternoon, the guided circuits had finished for the day, and the visitor-facing areas of the facility were winding down. Niev Carson was 38 years old, a travel writer who had spent years documenting wildlife parks and sanctuaries across South and Southeast Asia. She had photographed captive elephants at multiple facilities throughout her career and had developed, through that repeated exposure, a working confidence in her ability to read elephant behavior in managed settings. That confidence had been built from observation at a distance, through guided formats, under conditions that were controlled and supervised. It had not been built from the kind of close, unsupervised proximity she was about to seek. She had remained on the grounds after the guided tour concluded and moved independently through the facility. The elephant barn was a large, enclosed structure at the rear of the grounds, used for feeding, veterinary access, and rest. Access to the barn was restricted to authorized staff outside of guided tour windows. Signage at the entry marked the area as off-limits to visitors. Niev entered the barn alone. Facility records indicated the adult female Asian elephant present in the barn had displayed recorded behavioral indicators of stress over the preceding days, associated with elevated environmental noise from construction activity adjacent to the park and a disruption to the social grouping managed by the facility. The animal was chained in a standing position, consistent with standard barn rest. She was oriented away from the barn entrance. Niev moved behind the animal's flank to achieve the photographic angle she wanted. I've thought about that moment a lot. She had photographed elephants before. She had stood near elephants before. She had reasons, real, experience-based reasons, to believe she understood how to be around them. What she didn't have was any way to read that this particular animal, on this particular day, was not in the same state as the ones she'd photographed before. There was nothing visible that told her that. And that's the part that stays with me. Asian elephants are large, highly intelligent animals with a well-documented capacity for stress accumulation and unpredictable reactive behavior under conditions of chronic environmental stressor. An animal in a stressed state does not signal distress in ways reliably readable to an untrained observer at close range. The elephant's response to close-range approach from behind was immediate. She swung into contact with a forceful lateral strike that drove Neve into the structural support directly behind her, followed by a trampling response. The barn's confined geometry, solid walls, support pillars, and the animal's chain radius creating fixed boundaries in every direction, eliminated any space to which she could move. Death resulted from crush trauma sustained during the initial strike and subsequent trampling. The injuries were immediately fatal. Barn staff heard the disturbance and entered within a short time, but Neve was already unresponsive. Emergency services were contacted and arrived at the facility, but the severity of crush injuries precluded any intervention. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The facility records were there. The stress indicators had been logged. The staff knew the animal's state going into that day. Neve didn't. And in a barn, behind an elephant, that information gap was the only thing that mattered. Authorities conducted a formal investigation into access control procedures at the facility, focusing on the absence of any physical or supervised barrier at the barn entrance that would have actively prevented independent visitor entry after the guided tour program had concluded. Findings noted the recorded behavioral indicators of stress in the animal in the days preceding the incident. The elephant was not subjected to any punitive measure. Officials concluded the animal had responded to close-range rear approach under elevated stress conditions in a manner consistent with natural threat response behavior. The facility implemented keyed access on all restricted animal housing structures. Public commentary focused primarily on the systemic absence of enforced access control rather than on the individual conduct that preceded the incident.